So thank you very much. My name is Márk Nemes. I'm a PhD student from the University of Szeged, Hungary. As you can see, my presentation will focus on the moral panics regarding heavy metal music and the metal subculture, mainly fueled by various Christian congregations. Well, seems that the slide does not move. Okay, it's going. So, one of the early continental pioneers of this genre was Monsignor Corrado Baldocci, a Catholic priest, exorcist, and self-proclaimed demonologist. In his book titled Adoratori del Diavolo e Rock Satanico, or in English, The Worship of Devil and Rock Music, was published in 1991. The book was later translated to a variety of languages, among them to Hungarian in 1992, and was quite a popular reading material in Christian circles along the millennia. One interesting aspect of this book is that compared to many other titles published in the same period, namely the late 80s and 90s, its popularity allowed it to overgrow congregational limits, as the book was similarly popular in Protestant and evangelical and neo-evangelical circles as it was in Catholic ones. The book presents itself as a tool for orienting into heavy metal music and subculture, and as Corrado says, attempts to warn the youth to see the hidden face of reality and realize the lurking imminent dangers. Yeah, very, very dramatic. The book's core message fits perfectly into the trend of moral panics about the rising subcultures and countercultural movements. It warns the reader about subliminal and backwards masked satanic messages in rock and heavy metal records, aiming to reveal some sort of global satanist or devil-worshipping scheme whose messages are hidden deep in the lyrics, album covers, and stage acts of popular rock and metal bands. While these trends settled and dissipated in the US by the late 90s, in the Central Eastern European region, it just started to wind up as the regime changes and the opening towards the West allowed a fresh mass influx of new music genres and titles discussing the phenomena with a generally negative tone. However, before we move any further, it is best to define and contextualize what moral panics are and to elaborate their significance in the Central Eastern European region around regime changes. So, according to Stanley Cohen's monograph titled Folk Devils and Moral Panics, published in 1972, moral panics are a form of widespread, often irrational fear, which implies that someone or something threatens the values, safety, or interests of a community or society as a whole. These fears are typically fueled by sensationalist media and have the capacities to enforce out political or legislative actions. One example for this could be the Phonograph Record Backward Masking Labeling Act, passed in Sacramento, California, proposed by Congressman Robert Dorman in 1982. Moreover, moral panics are typically aimed towards one marginalized segment of society, differing in race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, nationality, religion, or, for example, subcultural interest, stigmatizing these and creating a scapegoat, or as Cohen words, a folk devil. These public mass movements based on false or exaggerated perceptions and information that exceeds the factual reality to society further reinforce already established stereotypes, exacerbating the differences and divisions. Cohen elaborates how these mass panics actually unfold. At first, a condition, episode, person, or group of individuals emerge to become defined as a threat to societal values, interests. In this phase, there is focused attention on the behavior, either real or imagined, on the scapegoat. These reports essentially strip these folk devils of any favorable characteristics. By exclusively applying negative traits, sensationalist media creates a non-associable evil persona. The demonization of said folk devils then creates a fast rise in societal awareness and provides an opportunity to further fuel public hysteria, often resulting in the passing of legislation that is overly vindictive, unnecessary, and serves to justify the agendas of those who are in power or authority, stabilizing their position. Summarizing, if anyone attempts to create a moral panic in today's very, very troubled days, pick a marginalized group that is easily definable, then create some kind of media attention about them. After a certain amount of public knowledge, political actors will include the presented issue into their agenda as heated public discourse unfolds, which will force legislative actors to answer with overly vindictive actions, after which the hysteria will quickly recede and only periodically re-emerge as a rallying tool for social and political movements with receding bases or communal trust. In American context, these moral panics about Satanism, rock music, or the heavy metal scene, or even subcultures as a whole, emerged in the early 1980s with the publication of Michelle Remembers by psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder. Although the book's claims of Satanist children kidnappings, sacrificial murders were disproven by several times in the upcoming decades, this publication opened a new and extremely lucrative market, tailored especially for high religious individuals and zealous Christians whose identity was based on strict and textual interpretations of the Bible. In the upcoming years, dozens of copycat titles appeared, fueling the satanic panic and even associating subcultural groups, like for example, the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing groups, sexual minorities, and of course the expanding heavy metal scene of the 80s, with claims of Satanism, occultism, sacrifices, and so on. Satanic panic was mostly present in evangelical circles, with whistleblowers like televangelist Bob Larson or Fletcher A. Brothers, and Gary Greenwald, who started holding backmasking seminars all over the country, or for example, Jim Swaggart, who paved the road for the first dedicated TV shows and series like the Petal Club or the 700 Club, or for example the Truth About Rock seminars presented by the Peters brothers. In Central Eastern European context, due to the former communist regimes, religious ideology was severely limited, and there was no competition against established churches. Segments of these established churches, like the remainder of the Catholic and Orthodox high clergy, was silently accepting, if not cooperating, with political oppressors, as the communist rule also stabilized their monopole position, instantly nullifying any non-established religious initiatives. Although it is here to be said that those who tried to resist inside established churches were quickly removed or fled the country. Of course, in Hungarian history we have quite a few examples for this. However, this all changed with the dissolution of the communist bloc and the opening towards the West. As Central Eastern Europe went through a turbulent regime change, sometimes peaceful, sometimes, well, not so peaceful. We know about this in the region's history. The opening to the West allowed an unregulated influx of new alternative social, subcultural, political, and religious narrative constructs. These former ground narrative providers within the region were destabilized in their position by this sudden plurality, which resulted in a crisis similar to what happened in the US in the 1960s. In this transitionary period, some turned towards trusted institutions, like traditional churches, seeking meanings, assistance, orienting in a strange new world. Of course, there were other crisis management strategies in this transitionary period, but I will not cover these, as our subject is mainly concerned with the first one of them, the return aspect, which is essentially doubling down on traditional religious formations, strengthening their narrative and cohesive functionality. Choosing this strategy meant that these institutions had to define themselves in... Should I hold it closer?
No, far.
Further away. Okay. So, choosing this strategy meant that these institutions had to define themselves in relation to the new products on the social and religious market. In this spirit, traditional religious institutes labeled themselves as solitary providers of morally and socially acceptable grand narratives and meanings, collectively rejecting the new influx, labeling them only with negative traits. The scapegoat creation of these new generational folk devils in the form of moral panics strengthened the traditional institutions, rallying greater number of church members The necessary written and rhetorical materials were already in reach from the 1980s American satanic panic. Hence, the only requirement was to reinvent these and recontextualize them into the Central Eastern European region's specific needs and situation. Corrado Balducci's work is one such attempt, tailored specifically for the region, with inspirations from relative American titles, the author's name as an exorcist, as well as his status in the church, and several previous publications offered a sense of authority, and his work was quickly brought off from any shop's shelves. His publication and the upcoming panic gave way to a local variation of a moral panic, rooted in Catholicism and traditionalism. This moral panic has developed in 4 distinct phases. Firstly, close affiliates of the Catholic Church, regular church attendants, ministry members, and congregational media started discussing the imminent threat in their respective spheres. Secondly, surrogate groups, such as concerned parents, social figures, with limited knowledge about the subculture and its relations to Satanism and occultism were reached. In this phase, we cannot yet talk about moral panic. To reach this phase, we need to observe the third stepping stone as sensationalist media and other religious congregations looking for interpretative sources approach the issue. These new actors seem to find varying signs in the accessible sources. It is here to be said that the accessible sources weren't just limited by language barriers, but were only accessible in printed form, as the digital revolution is yet to take place in the upcoming years and decades. In the media, the exaggeration of Corrado's quotes and overstating them meant greater numbers of readers. While in religious groups, using different coping mechanisms for settling in the societal developments, interpreted the rising phenomena as either competition or as a visible threat for their meaning systems. In the final phase, non-religious or non-church affiliated groups are reached, expanding the hysteria to overall societal levels, which resulted political or legislative debates, fueled by the aforementioned moral whistleblowers, setting the stage for future witch hunts and targeted legislative decisions, which we will see in the upcoming years, somewhere around the 2010s. If we observe the moral panic and its developments with special focus on the toolkits and platforms, we may also find parallels to church-based anti-cultism. These attempts selectively and actively utilized pre-established congregational frameworks to integrate warnings and ad absurdum descriptions during religious services, as well as thematical articles in insider media, religious conferences covering the rise of Satanism and occultism in their region, and their surrogate spheres, among them metal music and the heavy metal subculture.
Continue, go ahead.
So, this and the popularization of handbooks and informative pamphlets, such as Corrado's book, gave way to a regional wave of satanic and metal panic. Moreover, these ideas and notions had the capacities to enter into religious higher education, regularly appearing in theological course curriculums and in submitted theses as primary sources for verifying the negative aspects of heavy metal or any nonconformist or countercultural movement. It's quite interesting. During my research, I have inspected a handful of course curriculums about contemporary religiosity in Catholic theological courses, Calvinist sources, as well as Baptist and Lutheran sources, and I had the chance to actually get my hands on some Adventist course curriculums. And these are the thematical groups that I could have found. So, of course, most of these congregations had some meaning, had some interpretation of the sect and cult terminology, or pop culture, or Satanism, or, for example, counterculturalism, or satanic influences in society, as Adventists say. So, moving on to actually Corrado's works. It's very interesting. The product has 2 major parts. The first one introduces a personal take on the history of Satanism and occultism, discussing characters like Crowley or LaVey, and even providing details about religious practices and criminal records. These letters consist of elaborate descriptions of regular human sacrifices, ritual suicides, and even animal dissections. The second part is about Satanist rock and heavy metal music, starting with historical introduction of important characters and rock bands, which is followed by a series of accusations like subliminal messages, cult recruitment, brainwashing, backwards masking. The book covers the harm caused by the subculture, is extensive, and concludes itself in a third, much smaller, anti-rock initiative part. During the reading, I have highlighted some of the interpretations of the author that I would like to share with you. Of course, I do not want to mock the author, rather than emphasizing the fact that the moral panic even takes its effects on the writer, as he creates personal interpretations and sometimes false accusations based on certain information of what he had marginal or even non-existent knowledge. First, we have Iron Maiden. And the Maiden's title of Number of the Beast, which is, according to the author, is an orchestrated black mass every time the band plays it, and it is used to corrupt souls. Then we have the American hard rock band Kiss, whose name apparently means Kings in Satan's Service or Knights in Satan's Service. Very interesting interpretation. Then comes AC/DC, whose name apparently means Antichrist, Death Christ. And the little lightning sign between the first and the second part of the band's name refers to the Scandinavian god Thor, who is, according to Monsignor Corrado, a god of rock and roll, and also the devil himself. So it's a very interesting interpretation. Then we have, of course, Albert Productions, the record labeling company of AC/DC and many other major bands, whose name apparently doesn't refer to the founder Jacques Albert's family name, but to two smaller grimoires from the 15th and 18th century, namely the Grand and the Petit Albert. Finally, my personal favorite, and please don't laugh, we have thrash metal as trash metal, like trash in the bin. So yeah, Monsignor Corrado had some very interesting takes on these issues, and we have multiple other examples in his book. Now, turning back to more academically inclined approaches, observing Corrado's argumentations, it is clear that in his eyes, this subculture is a culture of harm on many levels. He distinguishes between physical, psychical, behavioral, and spiritual harm, of which he sees the spiritual as most destructive. Corrado utilizes the anti-cultist rhetoric from the era. He associates the metal scene with allegations of abuse, mental manipulation, as well as organized blasphemy, greater driving force for deviance and suicidal tendencies. He uses semi-scientific argumentations and sources, mostly from American televangelist Bob Larson's self-conducted research about, for example, spinal liquid resonations and the mental manipulation through the best play of various frequency changes. It is very interesting, very semi-scientific. According to him, these are empirical studies and established academic facts. He doesn't concern himself with any of the non-negative aspects about subcultural affiliation, like, for example, belonging, stress relief, or the artistic and creative endeavors of adolescent years. Summarizing my findings, the popularity and even the appearance of Corrado's works in this region can be interpreted as a symptom of transitionary periods, where the sudden appearance of a pluralist religious market forced traditional institutions to adapt and strengthen their previously monopole position. The popularity of the work is not in not just Catholic circles imply that various new denominations and non-dominant congregations had similar meaning crises at this time. Due to the absolute dominance of the printed media, these titles served as solitary providers of narrative meanings for interpreting a re-emerging new phenomena of subcultural complexes, which for some served as substitutes for religiosity, providing new alternative worldviews, orienting tools, and identities. And with this closing verse, I would like to thank for your attention, and I await the questions.